I browsed the classified section of the local newspaper. Not because I thought there was any real chance of finding work there, but because it killed time. Who the hell would ever hire an ex-con like me? Courier wanted, read the ad. Bicycle provided. Strong stomach and discretion required. Contact Auntie Flem for details. Auntie Flem? I wondered. There was no phone number or email, just an address. It wasn't that far away, and it was a beautiful day for a walk. In fact, every day since my release had been a beautiful day for a walk. I appreciated going where I wanted beneath the wide open sky, in a way that I never had before. No cell walls, no barbed wire fences, but only for now, I reminded myself. It would be easy to slip back into my old ways, and once the money ran out, I didn't trust my own ability to resist the temptation of easy cash. I'd fall. I was sure of it. And then, sooner or later, I'd find myself back there. The bright sunlight felt suddenly cold. I shuddered and looked at the newspaper again, hoping that Auntie Flem was serious about her offer. Her neighborhood was all quiet rows of small, working-class homes, with dark windows and well-tended gardens. The streets were so deserted that I figured the homeowners were all retired. Or dead. I saw movement behind the tight-shut curtains of the house across the street. I was being watched. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I was afraid I'd find someone standing just inches behind me, on the eerily empty sidewalk. But I'd come too far to turn back just because of a feeling. I hurried to the address from the newspaper. A cheerful yellow house at the end of a cul-de-sac. The knot in my gut grew tighter as I approached the front door. Weren't the roses below the window a little too pink and perfect? The grass was so green it almost looked painted. I rang the doorbell. It played a recording of singing birds throughout the silent house, and the door swung open. Auntie Flem? I asked. The last thing I needed was for some old lady to bust me for B&E. "Come in," called a voice from deep inside the house. Somewhere, pots and pans clattered together, and the delicious smell of baking filled the air. The place was so clean I felt like I was dirtying it just by stepping through the door. But I did as I was told. With its mint green carpet, pastel furniture, and cheerful decor, it was like walking into spring. There was even a Love, Eat, Pray sign on the wall. Wait, wasn't it supposed to be Eat, Pray, Love? Moving from the front door to the kitchen should have taken about 30 seconds, but it felt much longer than that. The floor-wallpapered hallway seemed to twist and stretch until I was no longer sure where I was or how long it had taken me to get there. According to the cat clock on the kitchen wall, 6 minutes had passed since I'd first walked into Auntie Flem's house. "There you are. Don't be a stranger, The middle-aged woman winked and gave me a friendly bump with her hips as she took a steaming cherry pie out of the oven. Her curly blonde hair and fake gold bracelets bounced as she bustled around the kitchen. Finally, she took off her oven mitts and scrutinized me. "You're here about the ad." "That's right, ma'am." I took a deep breath and got the hardest part of every job interview out of the way. "Before we get any deeper into this, you should know I have a criminal record. If that's going to be a problem, I understand. But I'm a hard worker, and..." Auntie Flem waved her spatula, and my jaw snapped shut. "Oh, don't worry about that, sweetie. Haven't we all done things in the past that other people think are bad?" Auntie Flem took a long sip of a margarita that had suddenly appeared in her hand. "You can start right now." A stack of yellow documents and a bone-white pen lay on the marble countertop in front of me, although I couldn't remember seeing them there before. I skimmed over the fine print, my eyes zeroing in on the pay. $2,000 per month. Not too shabby for a bicycle courier. I only pay in gold, of course, Auntie Flem went on. She reached into her pocket, pulled out an ounce, and slid it over to me. Here's an advance. She laughed at the stupefied look on my face. Take it to a pawn shop or bite it if you want, sweetie. I don't mind. It's the real deal. Maybe this Auntie Flem didn't trust the Federal Reserve. Or maybe she had a closet full of old folks' tooth fillings that she was going to melt down for my payment. I couldn't have cared less. To me, that little chunk of yellowed metal meant a roof over my head and groceries in my refrigerator. It meant freedom from going back there. As long as I was making money, I could keep myself clean. I hoped. I snagged the gold and signed beside the X before Auntie Flem could change her mind. A yelp escaped my mouth as I wrote. It was like the pen had bitten me. That's when I noticed the signature I'd scribbled wasn't written in ink. There was a cut on my finger where I'd grabbed the pen, and a few drops of my blood still dribbled from its tip. What the? Auntie Flem stood grinning beneath a mess this bless cursive sign. I felt dizzy. Here's your first delivery. Auntie Flem held out her fresh-baked cherry pie. The address is on the box. But that's to hell and gone from here. Your bicycle's waiting out front, sweetie. My new employer dismissed me with a twirl of her margarita. Maybe it shouldn't have come as a surprise that Auntie Flem's delivery bicycle was hot pink and covered with daisy stickers. It seemed high-end, although I couldn't see any brand name. With a sigh, I placed the pie in the front basket and pedaled off. It wasn't until I reached the end of the street that it occurred to me how odd it was that the frame and seat fit me perfectly. In fact, everything about the situation was strange. How had this Auntie Flem known that I'd been arriving right when her pie came out of the oven? What was with the creepy pen and the misspelled signs on the wall? Had she really shut me up with just a wave of her hand? As I pedaled across town, what had happened in that cheery kitchen began to take on the quality of a deeply disturbing dream. The kind that doesn't seem to end with waking up. I took a break to drink some water at a park water fountain, and when I checked my GPS, I groaned. I wasn't even halfway there yet. I gritted my teeth and told myself to think of the gold. A job. Stability. A life that just might be good enough to erase the memory of the one I'd thrown away. Hours later, on the 2-lane road outside of town, that goal felt a lot harder to see. The wind of passing trucks buffeted me mercilessly, and I struggled to dodge the ripped tires and broken branches along the side of the road. Finally, I saw the address I'd been given on a rusty mailbox at the end of a gravel lane. A huge calico cat sat in front of it, licking its paw. Something about its eyes disturbed me. One was an ordinary golden cat's eye, but the other one was round and white with a blue iris. It almost looked human. I stepped down from the bike to take a breather, and the driveway disappeared. I was looking at the same wall of trees that stretched to the horizon on both sides of the road. I touched the handlebars again. The rusty mailbox and gravel lane were back, although the cat was gone. I tried the experiment several more times, with the same conclusion. Another semi-truck rocketed past with a horn blast. Its wind nearly hurled me into the mud. With one hand on the bike, I took a deep breath and started forward. I had no explanation for what I'd seen, but I could put up with a whole lot of weirdness for what Auntie Flem was going to pay me. Sweat streamed down my back. The gravel lane seemed to go on forever. And was it just me? Or was the forest getting thicker? Huge, gnarled trees reached out with claw-like branches. The sky was just a green glow behind their leaves. The buzz of the insect sounded like a warning. Or a threat. My neck hurt from looking over my shoulder so much. Even though there was nothing but gloomy woods in all directions, I still felt like I was being watched. I tripped on a loose rock and the bicycle flew out of my hands. Cursing, I stood and picked gravel from my bleeding knees. The bicycle's rear wheel spun uselessly where it had fallen. Even worse, Auntie Flem's package had dumped its contents. A burnt black crust full of pale, writhing worms. I recoiled, yanking the bicycle away from the sickening sight. The moment I touched it, I was looking at a wholesome cherry pie again. I made sure to keep one hand on the bike frame when I reached out to pick it up and put it back in its box. As I did, I was sure I felt something squirming against the palm of my hand. Something about Auntie Flem's bicycle was preventing me from seeing the world how it really was. And that wasn't all. My legs were exhausted. Had the bike been somehow forcing me to ride faster than normal? In a clearing up ahead, a dark cabin squatted like a hunched-over troll. Between the moss growing on its slouching roof and the undergrowth consuming it, the cabin could have easily been mistaken for any other boulder in the forest. If it wasn't for the glint of eyes, and the squeak of a rocking chair from the front porch. I nervously checked the address Auntie Flem had written. Sure enough, it came with a name. Nanny Henbane? I called out. The rocking stopped.
What do you want?
An elderly female voice crowed. I got a delivery for you.
Delivery? I didn't ask for no stinking delivery. How'd you get all the way up here without getting eaten anyway? Well, it doesn't matter. I'll fix you right up, you sniveling little trespasser.
I heard the rocking chair creak. A huge form got to its feet in the shadows of the porch. Cawing birds circled overhead. I could hear rustling in the undergrowth, and something slithered against my ankle. If I didn't know better, I would have sworn the forest was coming to life, gathering around me for some kind of nightmarish feast. It's from Auntie Flem, I shouted desperately. The frenzy of movement stopped.
Well, why didn't you say so, you shit for brains? I guess you better come up.
The old woman sounded genuinely disappointed that whatever was about to happen to me had to be called off. Instinct told me to keep a firm grip on Auntie Flem's bike as I made my way through the hip-high weeds to Nanny Henbane's cabin. Slowly, my eyes adjusted to the dim light. I wish they hadn't. The woman in front of me was the largest and ugliest person I had ever seen. Pimples and warts covered her pale, almost moldy-looking skin. While I approached, she pulled a black booger from her enormous nose, inspected it, and ate it. One of her eyes was glass, the other a vivid blue I'd seen before, in the face of the cat at the end of the lane. She was knitting a scarf from a pink, slimy cord that stretched around to the other side of the building, where something moaned. I gulped.
Are your feet made of lead or something? Hurry up.
Nanny Henbane snatched the pie out of my grasp as soon as I was within reach.
Just what I needed. Wonder how she knew.
Her one good eye narrowed. I just deliver packages. I took a step backwards. I could hear things skittering away from me in the darkness. Today's my first day.
Well, you can deliver a package for me then, can't ya? Damned if I'm gonna wind up in debt to that miserable old sow, Auntie Flem.
Nanny Henbane set down her knitting and lumbered across the porch towards me. I pressed my back against a porch column to avoid brushing against her. I realized too late that the wood was covered with skittering insects. Nanny Henbane pulled a glittering knife from inside her filthy apron as she rounded the corner, stepping gingerly over the slimy pink cord she'd been using to make her scarf.
Still alive then, are you? Good. Because I need something else from you.
The moans from around the other side of the cabin intensified. Then, with a shwick sound, they stopped altogether. Moments later, Nanny Henbane came back around the corner and tossed me a glass jar, hitting my chest with such force that I nearly fell. I stared, fascinated, at the oddly familiar thing floating in green liquid.
The pickled tongue of a liar. You can give that to Auntie Flem.
Nanny Henbane declared triumphantly.
Mind you don't break it now. Otherwise, I'll have to replace it.
I realized with horror that her eyes were lingering on my mouth.
Have you ever told a lie, Butterfingers?
I backed away, unconsciously brushing away a few of the things still crawling in my hair. The knife glittered evilly in Nanny Henbane's hand. I'll deliver it right away. I jumped on the hot pink bike and started pedaling. The tires slipped and skidded, but I wanted to put some distance between me and that horrible cabin before sunset. Nanny Henbane's disgusting trophy bounced dangerously in the bike basket. The gravel lane had been gloomy even at midday, but now I could barely make out anything, except looming green shadows. I fumbled beneath the basket and let out a cry of victory. Auntie Flem's bike had a light. My relief was short-lived, however. The bright beam only deepened the darkness of the forest around me as I bumped and rattled down the path. The path? Hadn't I been on a gravel driveway just seconds ago? This was more like a narrow tunnel through the mossy branches. I shook my head and blinked. How had I gotten so off track? Worse, I doubted I had the strength to go back, and the thought of spending the night in Nanny Henbane's woods chilled my blood. While I cursed my decisions and wondered what I should do, a few glowing lights appeared in the trees to my left. Disconcertingly, they seemed to be coming my way. I gripped the handlebars with sweaty palms and rode on, wondering when this nightmare would be over. The twists and turns of the uneven dirt path all started to look the same, and there seemed to be no end to them. I rode on autopilot, my teeth and knees aching from the bumpy ground, my back sore from riding for so long, my mind full of the awful things I'd seen. Meow? A calico cat with strange eyes darted into the path. I slammed on the brakes and felt myself flying off Auntie Flem's bike. The liar's tongue. I grabbed it as I flew, clutching the jar to my chest to protect it as I skidded. When I finally crashed against a twisted tree trunk, I breathed a sigh of relief in spite of the pain. Nanny Henbane's delivery was intact. Grunting, I picked broken sticks from my ribs and brushed dirt from my bleeding shins. That's when I noticed the three shadowy figures advancing down the path behind me. This was no accident. It was an ambush. Their faces were manic. Their clothing looked like something from Alice in Wonderland. I only picked up fleeting details as I ran for the bike. A patchwork top hat, a sharpened hatchet, an angry mouth full of too many shining white teeth. Their running footsteps closed in on me as I leapt back onto Auntie Flem's bike, praying it wasn't too damaged to function, praying my agonized muscles still had the strength left to get away. In prison, an old-timer once told me that the most important thing in a life-threatening situation was to focus on the details, instead of on my fear. And that's exactly what I did. I kept my eye on taking each turn as fast as possible without losing control of the bike. Instead of looking over my shoulder at my pursuers, I kept my ears open for danger ahead, ignoring the insane laughter of the people behind me. Even though it felt like they were breathing down my neck, I kept pedaling, even when fear made my whole body want to lock up and surrender. As I rounded the next corner, I saw lights. Not will-o'-the-wisps or lanterns in the woods. Shopping center lights. I'd made it to the end of the trail. I'd never been so happy to see a supermarket parking lot. Somehow, Nanny Henbane's strange path had somehow dumped me out just a few blocks away from Auntie Flem's house. Once I reached asphalt, I looked back over my shoulder, but the trail and my strange pursuers were gone. I dismounted from the bike and limped the remaining distance to Auntie Flem's. It was nearly 11 p.m. and most of the houses on the street were dark, but my employer's porch light glowed like a beacon at the end of the cul-de-sac, like she was expecting me. I wasn't surprised when the door opened before I could knock. Auntie Flem stood in a hot pink fuzzy bathrobe and hair rollers.
"Well, aren't you a sight for sore eyes?"
She winked, one hand on her hip. With the other, she inspected the jar that held the liar's tongue and wrinkled her nose. She could have at least put a cute checkered cloth or bow on it. Some people just have no sense of style. I gulped. At first, I thought that the large, shadowy shapes behind Auntie Flem were furniture. Now I realized that they were moving. Oh, it's pretty late. I guess I should be going. Going? Auntie Flem threw back her hair-rollered head and laughed savagely. Oh, sweetie. You didn't think you were finished, did you? Your night's just starting. I need you to make a pickup for me. And if I were you, I'd get it and get out of the place before midnight. This isn't what I signed up for, I shouted, my hands clenched into fists. Sweetie, you have no idea what you signed up for. Auntie Flem snapped her fingers, and I felt my legs move without my consent. They lockstepped me over to the hot pink bicycle and sat me down on the seat. I couldn't prevent my hands from grabbing the handlebars. And it didn't stop there. I could feel my skin stretch and my bones bend as my body melded with that horrible bicycle. Seconds later, I couldn't tell where the handlebars ended and my own fingers began. But my legs were pedaling. My muscles moved on their own, ignoring the pain. As I approached the first major intersection, I realized that the bicycle wasn't going to stop until it got where Auntie Flem was sending me. I swerved at the last minute. Tires screeched behind me, but at the next stoplight, the bewitched bicycle was back on course. With a sinking feeling, I realized it was taking me to the city cemetery. Well, not exactly. Beside the graveyard wall rose a ridiculously fancy, old-fashioned house. The whole thing was painted mauve, with so many cupolas and gables that there didn't seem to be a square angle in the place. At first I wondered why I'd never noticed it before. Then I wondered if I was even capable of noticing it, without Auntie Flem's enchanted bike. Grandmother Minstrel read the name on the mailbox. There was no address. The bicycle turned up the driveway, and I did my best not to look at the oddly trimmed bushes that lined the yard. One had been cut to look like an ogre swallowing a child. Another looked like a dog with tentacles for a face. They were disturbingly lifelike, and they seemed to be watching me. Just when I thought for sure I was about to crash into the porch, brakes squealed and I flew over the handlebars. As the bicycle released me, it fell to the ground. Just an ordinary hunk of plastic and aluminum. I lay where I'd fallen for a while, listening to the blood pounding through my veins and massaging my aching legs. I noticed nervously that the monstrous bushes had turned around and were watching me. And that wasn't all that was wrong. I couldn't see anything past the edges of the weird house's driveway. It was like the whole world beyond it had disappeared behind a shroud of dark mist. My throat was too dry to swallow as I pushed myself to my feet and rang the house's antique doorbell. That's when I noticed the silence of the place. No birds chirped. No wind blew through the creepily trimmed bushes. It was uncanny. I wasn't at all surprised when a white-haired woman in a frilly purple dress opened the door. "Grandmother Minstrel?" I asked. The old woman gave me a toothless smile and beckoned me inside without a word. I couldn't see much in the gloom, but one thing was clear. The place was full of dolls. Hundreds of glassy eyes stared at me from every available surface. There was something strange about how the old woman moved among them, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Not then. Finally, she led me to a living room with a single doll-free chair, and sat down across from me on a gold-trimmed purple couch. The pot of tea on the table between us suggested that she'd been expecting me. She gestured to it. I shook my head. "I'm supposed to pick up a package?" I explained. There was no response. The silence deepened. Auntie Flem sent me?" I tried again. That got a reaction. "We do not use that name in this house," a voice sneered from the shelf beside me. The speaker was about a foot tall, and made of porcelain and rags. It floated down from its perch to settle on the old woman's lap. And I realized then what had been bothering me about her this whole time. The old woman didn't move like a person. She moved like a puppet. In fact, if I squinted hard enough, I could see her strings. They hooked cruelly into the old woman's skin and led back to the doll that had settled in her lap. Malice glittered in its beady black eyes.
But now that you're here,
the doll went on, in its creepy sing-song voice,
why don't we play a game? How about 2 truths and a lie? I'll start.
The way it cleared its throat sounded like strings scraping together.
1. This sad sack of bones isn't Grandmother Minstrel.
I am.
2. There isn't actually any package to pick up. You are the package. A sacrifice. To me. 3. There's no way out of that pesky little contract you signed.
Now that the old woman who let me in was sitting down, she was as slack and lifeless as a broken mannequin. Only the doll in her lap moved and spoke with any energy. I figured the first one was true, and I didn't see any package, which meant that Auntie Flem had sent me to Grandmother Minstrel's to die.
I really hope the third one is the lie,
I stammered.
Well done. Now sit still and listen. Try not to do anything foolish. I'd hate to have to make you into one of my forever playmates. Like them.
The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I realized that a semicircle of dolls and puppets had crept around behind me, watching me curiously with their eerily blank expressions. As I looked more closely at them, I realized that their plastic faces looked a little too imperfect to be factory made. A little too human. Their clothing, too, was just a shrunk-down version of fashions that had been popular over the past 100 years. It was like they'd once been people.
I'm sure you'd like to get out of your contract, no?
Grandmother Minstrel mused.
Go back to an ordinary life? Pretend that this was all just a bad dream?
Grandmother Minstrel clasped her tiny porcelain hands.
All that can happen. If the one whom you signed your contract with should happen to die, suddenly, and unexpectedly.
You mean...
Shh! Listen.
A purple velvet box with a golden key in its side floated down from the shelf above Grandmother Minstrel.
Your employer doesn't expect you to return from this little misguided delivery. She expects me to add you to my collection and forgive a certain debt that she owes me. But that isn't going to happen. Instead, you're going to go back to her lair, wind up this little music box, and leave it in front of her door. Then you're going to run away just as fast as your weak little flesh and blood legs can carry you.
Why? What will happen? I asked. The only reply was the ominous creaking of plastic limbs as the other dolls closed in around me.
Do you accept this task? Or would you prefer to join us for playtime?
She didn't have to ask twice. I forced myself to hold out my hand, and the music box floated gently down into it. It was heavier than its size suggested. Or maybe it was just my fear of what it held that made the innocuous little music box seem so heavy. The weight of death. The thought flashed unbidden through my mind as Grandmother Minstrel shooed me out the door. I stood, pretending not to notice the dolls and puppets clustered around my feet. When I retreated down the hallway, they followed me like a grotesque parade. Grandmother Minstrel was behind them, waving goodbye from atop the shoulders of her human puppet.
I don't expect we'll be seeing each other again, she snickered. But if we do, I'll make sure to have a place on the shelf for you.
When I'd arrived at Grandmother Minstrel's life-size dollhouse, I thought I was completely exhausted. I never would have imagined that I'd have the strength to bike back to Auntie Flem's. But now I had a purpose. I knew that she'd used me and sent me off to die. But Grandmother Minstrel had given me a chance to get revenge. And maybe even get free of my awful contract. The streets passed by in a haze. There was no one out this late at night. And even if there had been, I doubt they would have noticed me at all. Just an anonymous shadow on an old-fashioned bike. I braked at the top of Auntie Flem's suburban street and dumped her cursed bike in the grass by a fire hydrant. I didn't want to give her any sign that I was back. Her porch light blazed at the end of the cul-de-sac like a beacon, but its light was eerily tinged with green. I had the strangest feeling that she could watch me through it, if she'd wanted to. My legs were like jelly, but I still circled around through the backyards of the neighboring houses to avoid that ghoulish porch light. Unfortunately, I hadn't considered what Auntie Flem might have in her backyard. The little house was quiet as I approached its tall wooden fence, but as I tiptoed along it, I heard something massive charging toward me. It slammed into the fence, growling at me with the lowest, most hateful barks I'd ever heard. The wood began to bend. A dark, slobbering shape was pushing itself through from the other side. "Princess?" I heard Auntie Flem shouting. "Princess, what's wrong?" I had only seconds before Auntie Flem caught me. Devoured me. Or both. I lurched toward Auntie Flem's porch, twisting the key in the music box and opening it just as Grandmother Minstrel had commanded. I rang the doorbell and fled. I read the Bible a lot in prison. In fact, it was the only book I was allowed to have in my cell. Hobbling up the street that night, I thought of Lot's wife, who looked back at Sodom and Gomorrah and was turned into a pillar of salt for her sin. I wanted so badly to glance over my shoulder and see what that strange little music box was going to do. But I knew better. Auntie Flem's shriek pierced the air behind me. I didn't need to look over my shoulder to know that whatever Grandmother Minstrel had done, it had worked. I was hobbling homeward on exhausted legs when I heard a sound behind me that made my blood run cold. I recognized the squeaks of those pedals and gears. Auntie Flem's hot pink bicycle was steering itself toward me along the empty sidewalk, and there was a note wrapped around its handlebars. "Thank you ever so much for accepting my gift of a lovely antique music box. As repayment for this gift, I expect your services as my personal bicycle messenger to begin forthwith. Cordially, Grandmother Minstrel." Become a channel member today for early access, bonus videos, and special emojis only available to members. Check out the description below or click the join button for more info. If you'd like another way to help support the channel, please consider joining my Patreon page at patreon.com/Jordan Group Horror. As a patron, you'll get access to bonus videos and content. You'll be credited at the end of every video going forward, and if you decide to stay for 3 months, I'll name a character after you which will be featured in a Hollow's End story. Links to join the Patreon are in the description. Thanks everyone for listening. Please like, subscribe, and comment to help the channel continue to grow, and see you again next time at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Hope you have a great night.